A young mother, estranged from her husband, is home alone with her 20-month-old baby one night. The next morning, the landlord is looking to collect the rent and soon discovers a brutal homicide that will take 50-plus years to resolve. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and the New York Times best-selling author of dozens of true crime books. I've dedicated the past 26 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line.
One more night in my head, I'm stirring up dust and kicking cobwebs, looking for a light I've never known, with a pea out.
Judith Lord is a lifelong New Englander. Having been born in Maine and finding herself at the young age of 22 with her 20-month-old son living alone in an apartment complex in Concord, New Hampshire. Having grown up myself in New England and having traveled all over the country, New England is a bit different in the sense that there are pockets of areas where you can fully embrace the solitude and country living the region provides, but at the same time, you are not all that far from cities and more populous towns. Not saying you cannot get this anywhere else in the country, but out here, you tend to experience the benefits of both worlds within close proximity. Apartment living offers plenty of neighbor-to-neighbor socialization and people around all the time to talk to and mix it up with. Anyone who has lived in an apartment complex can agree, I am sure, and there are benefits and obstacles within that lifestyle. Though there are many people around you, you can still feel isolated, especially in a place where you're surrounded by pine trees, mountains, and open spaces. During the wintertime, things can feel extremely secluded. I am certain Judith Lord felt this way at times, and yet, she might have enjoyed the isolation or craved the opposite after having grown up in a household with 13 other siblings, Judith being the 11th child. At 18, Judith began dating a guy named Greg, who happened to be home on military leave when she met him in 1971. By March 1974, they were married. And Judith decided to take off with Greg on his next tour, which took them to Germany. Their child was born not long after they arrived. So she seemed to be living the dream life she had envisioned for herself. Judith has long, flowing brown hair, thick and shiny nearly down to her waistline, brown eyes, and a smile that could stop any man in his tracks, all of which spoke to the joy from having a baby. By October 1974, Judith and Greg had moved from Germany back to Concord, the capital of New Hampshire, and into an apartment on Spring Street, downtown. Concord was a city of about 30,000 people or so in the 70s. Spread out and rural, the city resides in the southern corner of the state, down where Massachusetts and Maine and New Hampshire all meet up, north of Nashua and Manchester. The 70s were a transitional time for the city as it stopped leaning so much on its industrial railroad routes and began to evolve into a quieter community-based city where families could prosper and raise their kids in a more family-friendly environment. This brought in more retail and service industries as downtown built itself into a place to visit rather than simply doing business. So there is this small town vibe wherever you go, with residents feeling as if they all know each other, but it's set against historic homes in a more traditional New England atmosphere while still maintaining the presence of being a capital city. I say all this because it becomes important. With the change in cultural tone, the city also began to bring in more people from all over. It wasn't just townsfolk any longer. Transients and strangers began coming in. With Greg and Judith back in Concord, living in an apartment downtown, Greg now out of the service, he lands a job at the local New Hampshire State Hospital as an attendant, while Judith begins working for a nursing home in town as an aide. By March 1975, Judith and Greg move once again into what they presume to be a bigger and better residence, the Concord Garden Apartments. Judith loves the place. She made friends easily. Residents and neighbors adore her. She'd grab her guitar and the baby and sit on the front steps and play while her son enjoyed himself on the lawn right there in front of her. Such a comforting image from the 70s we see so much of in popular culture, photos, and films. The flower child movement, peace and love, no phones or distractions, a guitar, a woman in love with singing, a baby, and that was life. Judith is someone within the apartment complex everyone sees as a kind, thoughtful, caring young woman, just 22 years old, remember, and just starting out her life. The building itself is a 2-story complex. There are pine trees surrounding long buildings with rows of 2-story apartments next to one another. Again, this will become important. Judith is working for nearby McCurley's nursing home, so she and Greg are doing okay financially. It's not a cakewalk, but they're not starving. On May 4th, 1975, Greg picks Judith up at work. As soon as she gets into the vehicle, Greg kind of starts in on her. They begin arguing. There is no record I have seen detailing what this argument was about, but within a young family, there is always plenty going on. And Judith had a secret as well, which I'll get into later. And this could have been what they fought about. Slamming car doors and still going at it, when they arrive home, the argument escalates when they get inside. Greg goes upstairs to get away from her and maybe calm down a bit. Judith follows, and they continue to fight. Greg is in the bedroom, standing in the walk-in closet. Whatever was said next, it riled Greg up to the point of him hitting Judith. Then he pushes her into the closet and continues to strike her. As she is on the ground, Greg goes at her again and only stops when Judith pleads for him not to hit her anymore. I have to believe this was not the first time that he hit her. The cops arrive. Judith meets with them out front. He assaulted me, she tells them, before explaining what happened. This was no love tap. Greg didn't hit the woman. He had beaten her savagely. Cops reported that Judith had 2 black eyes, a lump on the back of her head, and dried blood around her mouth. That is a very violent beating. Greg is arrested for, get this, simple assault. Doesn't sound that simple to me, but there you go. The 1970s. Greg pleads guilty, and his punishment for literally beating Judith like she was a punching bag is a measly $100 fine. Again, the 70s. Disgusting. You need to move out, Judith tells him. Greg agrees and proceeds to take all of the furniture in the apartment, leaving Judith a report of the incident notes with only a bed and the baby's crib. Nice guy. Where does Greg go? Just across the street to his grandmother's house. Judith quits her part-time job so she can stay home with the baby. Just over 2 weeks later, on May 19th, 1975, near 4 p.m., Judith arrives home to her apartment, and Greg is with her. They had gone to the bank to cash Judith's final paycheck from the nursing home. Judith had her neighbor and friend watch the little boy while they were out. Nothing is on record regarding what transpires between Judith and Greg from that time, around 4:30 p.m., until later that evening. If we are going to make assumptions, we should assume that Greg and Judith had calmed down since their blowout when Greg beat her, and that Greg had left to go back to his home across the street. Near 8 p.m., Judith is outside with several apartment friends and neighbors who are playing volleyball. This is just behind Judith's apartment. They have some fun, they joke around, get some exercise, until about 10:30 p.m. when the group splits up. Judith joins two others at one of their apartments for coffee. The woman whose apartment they wind up in is Linda Gable, who shares her apartment with her husband, Ernest Gable, who is not home at the time. He's working. They live right next door to Judith, and there is a common wall between the two apartments. Near 11 p.m., Judith says to another neighbor there with her and Linda, "A guy, can you come with me next door and check out my apartment? I left the back door unlocked." Judith was fearing that someone might have gotten in, and she told the group that she feared greatly for her safety lately. The neighbor goes in. Judith waits nearby. The guy has a look around and comes back out. "I searched up and down the stairs, all the rooms, and found nothing amiss," he says. Judith goes in and grabs 3 cans of Pepsi, comes back out, and they go back to the Gables' apartment to hang out. Near 11:30 p.m., Judith decides to go home, but then she quickly returns back to the Gables to borrow a pair of shoes from Linda Gable. Near midnight, Linda can hear the shower next door being turned on and the water running, and she knows from that sound it is Judith taking a shower. It's now near 12:45 a.m. when things begin to happen that will take upwards of 50 years to fully explain and resolve. We'll get into that next. More Crossing the Line with M. William Phelps, a true crime podcast, in 1 minute. Judith Lord had a feeling, something inside her telling her that someone was watching her, stalking her, obsessing over her, and she knew who it was. If you are a female and you have the same feeling at any time in your life, my advice is to listen to it. It is there for a reason. It might just be your spidey sense overreacting. But an overreaction is not going to hurt anyone. If you go ahead and start blaming the neighbor without proof, well, that is another story. That's not what I'm talking about. But I think you know what I mean here. Listen to your intuition. It will never lie to you. Near 12:45 a.m., a co-worker of Ernest Gable, Linda Gable's husband, drops him off out front of their door. That is one thing that is going on here at this time. A second thing takes place about an hour later, near 1:30 a.m., when several of Judith's neighbors are awoken out of sound sleep by a woman screaming at the top of her lungs. Judith's other neighbor on the opposite side of the gables, Barbara Knoll, positively identifies the woman screaming as Judith. And she sounds like she is terrified for her life. First, it was a scream. Then Barbara hears Judith yell these words, "Leave me alone, leave me alone," just before her voice is suddenly muffled, as if someone placed their hand over Judith's mouth. The screaming and Judith's terrified voice last just a few minutes, all of the neighbors later report, before an eerie silence takes over. Another neighbor, who also shared a wall with Judith, after hearing that screaming, reports that he heard moaning, as in a sexual way. And I quote the guy here, "The bed really started to bang away." And he is referring to two people engaged in sexual intercourse. These noises, that neighbor says, continue on and on for some time, and he just assumed that Judith was having sex with someone. Nobody called the police, apparently. Most everyone simply believed a woman screaming, leave me alone," in a terrifying manner was a bit of foreplay or something. I don't know. There is no report of police showing up at the apartment that night. The following morning, the rent collector is making his rounds around the complex. He arrives at Judith's to collect the rent near 12:30 p.m. He knocks and gets no answer. Impatient, he knocks again. Nothing. Then he hears Judith's baby crying. Walking in after getting a key from the office manager, he sees the baby on the first floor, alone, with no sign of Judith. There's a strange feeling inside. Something is wrong. The baby seemed to be fending for himself for quite a while. So he walks up the stairs to see if Judith is okay. Checking the rooms, he comes to Judith's bedroom. And there she is, on the bed. But he's unsure if it is actually Judith because there is some sort of blue cloth or sweatshirt covering her face. He walks over, lifts up the cloth, and realizes it is indeed Judith, and that she is in fact dead. He calls the police. Officers show up and begin to analyze the crime scene. Judith's room, according to one report, is in disarray. It's clear a violent struggle ensued. One of the curtains from a nearby window had been pulled off the wall and is on the floor near the bed. In fact, the curtain rod is still with the curtain. The bed was pulled away from the wall. A small mirror and a lampshade are knocked over. The alarm clock, presumably at one time on a bedside table, is on the floor and had stopped at 1:47 a.m. So we know the murder took place close to that time frame. Judith is covered by a blanket and lying on her back. They walk over and remove the blanket, and she is completely nude. No doubt she has been raped before being strangled to death. As they are combing through the bedding, they come across an unsmoked Marlboro cigarette, which was on top of the bedspread covering her body. By May 21st, the New Hampshire State Police Forensic Lab team of investigators are on the scene collecting any additional evidence. They wind up with 23 pieces of forensic evidence from the bedroom alone, including 2 towels, Judith's purse, that bedding, and what they call a blue plastic sauna suit, the item the rent collector saw covering her face when he first went into the room. A sauna suit, by my calculation, is like a poncho or a sweatshirt. The one specific item they are immediately interested in is a purple towel found at the foot of the bed. Crumbled and folded over, the used towel, the state police indicate in its report, quote, is noticeably damp with 3 hardened stains consistent with semen, and a white baby towel next to the bed also has 2 similar stiff stains, which of course means DNA. But it's 1975. Because the towel is damp and the semen stains are stiff, they draw the conclusion that the crime took place after Judith had taken her shower, which is important. So they now have a clearer time frame of when the rape and murder occurred, somewhere after 12:30 and before about 2 a.m. I want to point out before we get into this next area of discussion that this report I have been referring to was generated almost 50 years after the crime by the Attorney General's office. So although it is loaded with information, it's not real-time information law enforcement was getting during the course of the early investigation. I want to be clear about that. Because as they begin collecting trace and forensic evidence from Judith's body, they come across 5 hairs, which are, the report says, quote, found to be of African American origin. 1 in her left hand, 1 on her lower abdomen, and 3 from the bedsheet she was lying on. I think had they known that specific information about the perpetrator's race in 1975, and there was no technological way they could have then, this case would have been solved within a day or so. Why do I say this? Ernest Gable, who, if you recall, was dropped off by a coworker at home near 12:30, 12:45, is a black man. And the man had a very extensive record of violent behavior towards women. Let's take our second break here, come back, and get into how this investigation progresses. You are listening to Crossing the Line with M. William Phelps. I'd like to let you know I have a new book out, the first book I've published in 5 years. It's called They Came for Blood. I have always wanted to write Westerns, a dream since my childhood. Tom Callahan was once President Ulysses S. Grant's deadliest kept secret, a lethal gun for hire leading a team of assassins nobody knew existed. Now those days are over, or so he thought. Therefore, when the past comes for blood, you either draw first or die trying. Look for They Came for Blood on Amazon.com or anywhere books are sold. Check it out. There's a lot of murder in the book, so it's not a departure from my day job. I cannot underscore enough the brutality of this murder and rape. This poor woman, whose child was in another room, was beaten, raped, and strangled inside her own home as she prepared to get ready for bed. She had scratch marks on her face and neck, cuts inside her upper lip, and her neck was basically clamped all the way around by 2 very large hands which had squeezed the life out of her. There were also markings over her mouth and nose, indicating that her murderer covered her face with his hand at some point, which was likely when the neighbors heard those screams and Judith yelling suddenly become muffled. Nobody called the cops. Then there's the blue plastic sauna sweatsuit found over her face. Sometimes a killer who knows the victim will cover the victim after the murder as a gesture of not wanting to see someone they once knew, now dead, or as a way of honoring the person. And I know that sounds counterintuitive and twisted. Mothers will do this to their children sometimes after killing them. So you understand what I mean by that. But in this case, the coroner reports that blue plastic sweatsuit was actually used to suffocate Judith. The autopsy found additional trace and forensic evidence in the form of several more hairs, skin scrapings underneath her fingernails, and fluids inside of her. There was an abundance of DNA left at this scene by Judith's murderer. The problem is the era in which the murder was committed. We just didn't have the technology then to do what we do today, or even 15 to 20 years ago. And killers, of course, knew this. This is one reason why we are seeing so many cold cases solved today. The amount of DNA left behind without a worry of being identified back then. So where do you go from here if you are investigating this brutal crime? Well, the husband, of course. He is the obvious suspect, especially seeing that he and Judith had gotten into an argument that turned violent a while back, and they had actually split up. As investigators talked to Greg Lord, additional investigators focus on that neighbor who claimed he heard Judith having sex in her bedroom, while others put a bead on Ernest Gable, her friend Linda Gable's husband. One of the three, the husband, the neighbor, or Gable, killed Judith. There is no question about this in the minds of investigators. They begin talking to people around the complex. In doing that, what is described in the reports as a consistent, disturbing theme soon emerges. Judith had been terrified of Ernest Gable. He had made persistent and unwanted sexual advances towards her ever since she moved in. The guy would not leave her alone. One neighbor tells a story of Judith 10 days before she was murdered, coming over, out of breath, really scared, pleading, "I am afraid to stay home alone." She went on to explain she was terrified of, number one, her husband coming back and hitting her, or worse, and number two, Ernest Gable. Gable would catch Judith outside or walking by his apartment and tell her he was desperate to see her nude. On that May 10th night, 10 days before the murder, with Linda Gable out of town, Ernest shows up at Judith's door near 2 a.m., banging. "Open up." She opens the door. Gable says, "Why don't you come and party with me?" She says, "God, no. Go away." There were times when Judith would come home and look out her window only to see Gable standing there staring at her. He'd be constantly knocking on her door. He had put the fear of God in Judith, like she knew he would one day do something. They interviewed Gable's co-workers, some of whom said that he had always been talking about Judith in the most sexual and vilest ways, promising them that one day he was going to, quote, "get me some of that white meat," end quote. Greg Lord, the husband, apparently had an alibi. He had gone fishing until 10 p.m. that day, with several people vouching for him. And when he got home to his grandmother's house across the street where he lived, the grandmother said he never left. They, of course, didn't want to take that info at face value and rule him out completely. He could have gotten people to lie for him. So they asked him to take a polygraph. The first polygraph he takes was ruled inconclusive due to his emotional state at the time. So they drag him in for a second one in July 1975, months after the murder. Greg passes that one with flying colors, the lead investigator at the time going so far as to say there was no doubt this man was telling the truth. Something you'll want to remember. With that information, they directed the focus of their investigation away from the husband and put a header on Gable and that other neighbor, the guy who says he heard Judith having intercourse. A major setback happens when swabs collected from Judith come back and are determined to be gelled and unsuitable for any further examination. This was, as I say, early days of blood typing and blood testing and forensic examination. The case fizzles, with nothing of circumstance happening for decades. I would think they went back here and there and tried to get Ernest Gable or the other neighbor to confess, or used whatever technological breakthroughs they had available at the time, but nothing came together. Judith's case wound up, like a lot of cases here in New England and all over the country during the 1950s through the late 70s, in cold case storage with little manpower or funding to reinvestigate or send out evidence for testing. It's just the way it was. In 2008, a review of the case determines that those polygraphs Greg Lord had taken back in the day were of little or no value due to, of all things, the official testing cards for both exams considered to be not probative enough. They were asking the wrong questions, and although it's not in the report, my bet is the most important part of a polygraph, the pre-polygraph interview, either wasn't done or was faulty as well. Digging through the files, they come across a report from the day Judith's body was found. Apparently, investigators had brought Greg Lord down to Concord Hospital for a physical examination. They were working under the theory that you cannot murder and rape a woman in such a violent manner and not wind up getting injured yourself. This is good police work, in my opinion. They were looking to compare any injuries Greg had with what they knew took place in the room based on Judith's autopsy. And so the focus was once again back on the husband, despite his alibi and those polygraphs. Remember, they do not know at this time that the hair found in the room and in Judith's hands is from a black man. Not sure why they didn't take Ernest Gable down to the hospital and do the same, but that's what it is. When all else fails, blame the husband, right? And in this case, the guy was a shitbag who beats women to begin with, which is promising prior behavior when you're searching for a murderer. I can see why they went after him. Greg Lord doesn't help himself, however. While he's being questioned, after asking him if he had been inside the apartment that night, Greg screams at investigators saying, and this is a direct quote, "What do you think? I strangled her and then I effed her while she was getting stiff? Do you think I am some sort of effing pervert?" Beyond the vulgarity, what stood out to them was that Judith's cause of death, strangulation, and the fact that she had been raped had not been released publicly. How could Greg Lord possibly know those facts? Had Greg Lord and Ernest Gable committed this savage rape and murder together? I need to take one final break. We'll come back and conclude the shocking, awful, sad story. You are listening to Crossing the Line with M. William Phelps, a true crime podcast. Please subscribe to Crossing the Line wherever you get your podcast. And don't forget, leave a review of the show, especially on Apple Podcasts, and log on to crossingtheline.biz or mwilliamphelps.com to contact me and suggest cases, or just say hi. And look for me across all social media platforms using the @ symbol and my name, M. William Phelps. Thank you for supporting this show. I am allowed to do it because of you, and that truly means more to me than I can say. Biting his nails. That is what saves Greg Lord from being the target of a second round of serious investigation. Greg bit his nails, and so they determined from that hospital report that there was no way he could have scratched Judith. And they know that her killer had scratched her with his long fingernails. And they also know that Judith was murdered by one person. Still, how did Greg know before it was public that his wife had been strangled and raped? Come to find out, Greg had run into the house just after police arrived and went up the stairs and saw Judith dead inside the bedroom, which was how he had speculated she'd been strangled and raped. And then there was the problem of his DNA, as they began to test it later, which was not a match to any of the DNA connected to the case. As they go through everything about Greg once more, his alibi, his story over the years, and even the polygraphs, They eliminate him for good. Then it is learned that the neighbor who spoke about Judith's bed banging against the wall and her screaming during what he presumed to be sexual intercourse had actually been having an affair with Judith himself. That was her secret, which she and Greg were likely arguing about when he beat her. The neighbor and Greg hated each other, obviously, and the neighbor had often carried a gun around with him because he was so scared of Greg. This neighbor now becomes a prime suspect. As they are re-interviewing this guy, he changes his story, saying that on the night of Judith's murder, that voice he heard, it could have been Ernest Gables. When they ask him about this again in 2008, he goes back to his original story of the voice being Judith's. Then they re-examine all of the fingerprint evidence and find that Ernest Gables' fingerprints were found on the window downstairs into Judith's apartment. They ask Gable. He says he and that other neighbor under suspicion were actually leaning on Judith's windowsill one day talking to some girls, and that he had once helped Judith get into her apartment after she locked herself out. As they press him, Gable says he's done talking. He's nervous, stumbling over his words, agitated, and says he will not be cooperating with the investigation any longer. I'm done. So they focus on the timeline, and Gable fits directly into it. He had been dropped off by a coworker, if you recall, on that night around 12:30. A major red flag pops up when they begin looking into Ernest Gables' life. Multiple former girlfriends provided accounts of Mr. Gables' proclivity for combining sex with acts of strangulation and simulated rape, the report says. Now, what is disturbing to me is that this information was generated by investigators back in 1978. These accounts, as I read through them, are some of the most disturbing and violent statements regarding simulated rape during sex I have seen. One after the other. The guy had been strangling, scratching, and beating his girlfriends during sex. One woman said Gable had told her of a plan he had to kill one woman by placing a plastic bag over her head and strangling her. Again, they had this in 1978. What's more, the guy had a long history of criminal behavior, having moved to Concord from Mississippi and had gone by several aliases. Between 1969 and Judith's murder, he committed 4 different felonies. On top of that, he was arrested in Illinois for armed robbery and murder in 1977 and served time in prison. Years later, he kidnapped his 2 daughters and kept them for 14 years. With all of this, you would think investigators knew that he had killed Judith. And I think they did. The big holdup, the one major roadblock in prosecuting Gable back in the 70s was flawed science. They knew they had Gable's hair, but the science wasn't quite able to prove it in a court of law. In fact, quite remarkably, the FBI lab back in the late 1970s excluded Gable as being connected to those hairs. Excluded him. So instead of prosecuting Gable and risking him being let off and double jeopardy coming in, they held off until the science caught up. In August 2025, they were finally able to show that the hairs are in fact directly linked to Ernest Gable and could not belong to anyone else. There was a problem with arresting Gable, however. In 1987, while using the alias Ernest Stanberry, 36-year-old Ernie got into a squabble over money with a dude in Los Angeles, and the dude stabbed him in the chest and killed him. Oh well, them's the breaks when you're a piece of garbage living a violent life. That murder likely saved dozens more women from the wrath of Ernest Gable. I'm not advocating for murder, but you know what I mean. The total sum of this rather extensive report done on the case by the Attorney General's office concludes this way. The convergence of irrefutable DNA evidence, fingerprint analysis, compelling witness testimony, and Mr. Gable's own incriminating behavior and violent history establishes, beyond any reasonable doubt, that he was the perpetrator. On Judith's gravestone, the family chose a passage from King Solomon, which I feel is so appropriate within the scope of the work we do here on Crossing the Line with M. William Phelps and the victims' advocacy work I have been involved in throughout my career. Quote, "Justice will only be served when those who are not injured by crime feel just as indignant as those who are." Amen. The picture carved into her headstone is of Judith strumming her guitar, now playing, I know, for the angels that she is one of. That's it for this week. Be safe, be aware. Sources for this episode include Attorney General's report regarding the May 20, 1975 murder of Judith Lord in Concord, New Hampshire. November 24th, 2025, AG John Formula. Decades-old murder solved after new analysis. November 25th, 2025, WMUR News by Kirk Enstrom and Ariel Metropolis. Killer identified by Carrie Green, CBS News, November 25th, 2025. Crossing the Line is executive produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Matthew Valentinus, Mom's Basement Management. Written by me, M. William Phelps. Audio mastering and mixing by Matt Russell. Music by Epidemic Sound. Original music written and performed by Thomas Mooney, Tom Phelps, and Matt Russell.